Excellent. Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining tonight. We have John Polo to talk about self-care. John is a grief and life coach, author, and Camp Widow presenter. He lost his wife, Michelle, to a rare form of cancer in 2016. John discovered a deep passion for writing and speaking about love, loss, grief, healing, empowerment, and hope. He is the author of 4 books and has a goal to help others both honor their pain and see that a hopeful tomorrow can indeed exist. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Bobby. So thank you guys for having me today and for signing up. We're going to talk about self-care. But before we do, I just want to give you a little bit of background on my story. So when I was 17 years old, I fell for my dream girl. And it took me 2 months to ask her out because confidence wasn't my strong suit at that point. But I found her out, and she said yes. And then I was dating my dream girl and I fell madly in love. And it was good until it wasn't good. So it lasted about a year and then she broke my heart. 7 years later, I was sitting at my computer going over some email, and up popped an email from Michelle. We had lost all contact for those 7 years. We talked for an entire year before she came to visit me. I think we were both so scared about the past that we took it really slow. And when she did come visit me, we realized that we had always loved each other. We had admitted that to ourselves and to each other, and we started building a life together. 2.5 years after that, she got diagnosed with one of the worst cancers known to man, and she had it for 2.5 years before she passed. She was 30 and I was 31. I used to say I was broken as my wife had cancer and was dying of cancer, and after she died, I used to say I was broken. And then about a year ago, I realized something. I wasn't broken. I was shattered. I was absolutely shattered, completely convinced that I could never, ever, ever survive, let alone rebuild. And I remember 8 months out, I was on the floor sobbing in the master bedroom that was now mine and no longer ours. And it hit me in that moment that I had been a caretaker for everyone my entire life, since the age of 12, when my mom got sick. So for 15 years for my mom, for a year when my dad had cancer, and then for Michelle for 2.5 years. I had always taken care of everyone else, and I had never, ever, ever taken care of myself. It hit me in that moment, and it wasn't an epiphany that I had based on some grand self-worth. It was an epiphany born out of necessity. If I was going to survive this and have a chance of rebuilding, I had to start making myself a priority in my own life. One of the things I love to do right here is point out the fact that I said a priority and not the priority. I don't get on Zoom meetings or in front of people at Camp Widow or wherever I'm speaking and tell somebody you have to make yourself a priority in your own life, because I don't know their story. I don't know if they're sitting in the back of my room and they have 4 small kids at home and they can't make themselves the priority in their own life. But I truly believe that we all have the ability to make ourselves a priority in our own life. So when we look at self-care right now, we're going to look at self-care in some different ways, not the typical ways that you think of. This is normally about a 90-minute workshop that I do. We have about 35 minutes today or so before we start to take some questions. So I'm going to condense it a lot, okay? And we're just going to go over some basic points. When I had that epiphany that I had to make myself a priority in my own life, one of the things I did was I began to think about the people in my life. I had some great support, and I also had some people that were making my life much more difficult. You know, people will say, well, nobody can understand our pain, and we can't expect them to understand our pain. And I firmly agree with that. I never expect any human to understand my pain. But what I do expect is every human, especially those in my actual real life, to respect my pain. And one of the things I've learned over the last 7.5 years is that people are a version of self-care. And the people that you surround yourself with matter. And they're going to have a huge impact on your grief, on your healing, on your rebuilding, and on your trying to live again. People are a version of self-care. Let me give you this really basic example to paint the picture. Let's say you have 2 people in your life and they're both named Susie. You have 2 Susies in your life, okay? One is your friend Susie and one is your cousin Susie. You love your friend Susie, right? You guys meet once a lunch for breakfast, and you get up that morning, and even though you're missing your person, you're looking forward to the day because you get to see your friend Susie, and you're getting ready that day, and you're like, all right, this is going to be at least a good hour. I'm going to have a good hour today because I get to see Susie. And you're driving to see her, and you have the windows down and the music on. And when you're there, she listens to you. She respects your pain. She validates what you're saying. She's not afraid to say the name of your person, and she lets you openly talk about your person. She's nice to the wait staff. She makes you laugh, and you even make her laugh. The worst part of that day is when you have to get back in the car and go home because you don't get to see your friend Susie for a whole nother month. Spending time with that individual who made you feel seen and heard and validated and hopeful, who respected your pain, that is a version of self-care. Now let's look at your cousin Susie. You don't even like your cousin Susie, but your mom has guilted you since you were 11 years old, and you still carry that with you today. So you also meet your cousin Susie once a month for breakfast. As soon as you get up that day, though, you're like, I can't believe I have to meet this human. I can't believe on top of everything else, I have to meet this human for a whole hour, and maybe even longer if the restaurant's taking a while, right? And you get up and you're driving there, and you're not in a good mood because you know what's coming. And you're there, and she does the exact opposite. She doesn't talk about your person, and she looks at you kind of funky when you start to talk about your person. She doesn't validate your pain or respect it. She certainly doesn't make you laugh. And if you even show some signs of rebuilding or life again or hope, she kind of poo-poos on you for that too. There's nothing about that experience with that Susie that's good. And by the way, she's mean to the waitstaff and she's embarrassing you. The best part of that time with your cousin Susie is when you get to pay the check, get out of there and drive home. Spending time with that one individual is a version of self-care. Spending time with the other version is the exact opposite of self-care. The statistic, and I don't know where the statistic comes from, but the statistic is that widowed people on average lose a big part of their circle. And it shouldn't scare you if it's not happening to you yet, because it's not everyone. But the statistic is that we lose about 70% of our circle. I lost about 100% of my circle, or if it wasn't 100, it sure was close to it. And when I was 12 years old, my mom got really sick and I got really depressed and I withdrew from everyone. And I was that kid who I can remember being on the floor crying because I had no friends. And then my wife died and I started to lose all the people, all the secondary losses that come with it. And now I was 31 on the floor crying because I didn't have my wife and I didn't really have anybody in my life. And the people I did have in my life made me feel worse. It was like I had went back 17, 18, 19 years. A month after my wife passed, a friend suggested I start a blog. And I did it with no intention of it becoming what it has today. I did it as purely a place to talk about my grief. About a year after that, somebody who followed the blog told me about this thing called Camp Widow. What is that? That sounds weird. And I don't like to camp. And I don't have a sleeping bag, so that's not going to work for me. And they said, no, that's not what it is. And they said, you need to apply to be a speaker. And as an introvert who used to be painfully shy, I was like, I don't know about that. But I went to my first Camp Widow 18 months out. And for the first time in 18 months, I felt like I had community. I felt seen. I felt heard. I felt a part of a group. I felt alive again. On that trip, I noticed parts of the new me coming to life. And on that trip, I noticed parts of the old me coming back to life. I was funny again on that trip. I'm like, I haven't been funny since my wife got diagnosed with cancer. When I had that moment, if you go back 8 months out, remember I was telling you 8 months out, I was on the floor sobbing. And I knew I had to make myself a priority in my own life, but I didn't know what that meant. When I went to Camp Widow, almost a year later, it started to hit me. When I came back, here's what I started to do. I started to zone in on me. The way I had zoned in on my mom when I was taking care of her, and the way I had zoned in on my dad when I was taking care of him, and the way I had zoned in on my wife when I was taking care of her. And I started to pay incredibly close attention to who I was around when I felt better and who I was around when I felt worse. I started to pay incredibly close attention to what I was doing when I felt better and what I was doing when I felt worse. I started to zone in so hard on where I was at when I felt better. Camp Widow. and where I was at when I felt worse. My family's house. I started to make myself a priority in my own life. The next thing I want to talk about are the 6 words that I really began to focus on. If you have pen and paper, write them down. If you don't, that's okay. The 6 words I really began to focus on are these: happy, peaceful, healthy, rested or rejuvenated, whatever speaks to you most, productive, and hopeful. I'm going to take a sip of water and then I'm going to say them one more time for you guys. Happy, peaceful, healthy, rejuvenated or rested, productive, and hopeful. You know, I have a video where the video is entitled, "Hope Used to Fill Me with Rage." When my wife is dying and after she died, if someone would try to talk to me about hope, it would literally fill me with rage. It wasn't that I just didn't want to believe in it. It actually angered me. How dare you try to talk to me about hope as my wife is dying? How dare you try to talk to me about hope after my wife died? That's one of the most important things I think I can tell people when I'm speaking to them, because nobody is inspired by somebody on third base. Nobody cares that I have 4 books out, or I'm a speaker, or a coach, or I'm doing well today. Who cares unless you know how shattered I was? Who cares unless you know that the thought of hope or any of these 6 words seemed like an impossibility? But when I came back from my first Camp Widow, 18 months out, I started to focus in on these 6 words. And I started to focus in on them in a way where I paid attention to anything and everything that made me feel any of these words, even if only for a second. So let's go through a couple examples. Let's say you're a grandma. And yeah, that pain, it still feels overwhelming almost every day. But when you spend time with your grandkids, you feel some happiness. It doesn't have to be the most overwhelming happiness in the history of happiness, but you feel some happiness. We've identified one thing that makes you feel happy. That's a version of self-care. Let's say that peaceful. Let's say you like to meditate. I actually can't meditate. My form of meditation is either music in my earbuds or going out in nature and staring at a piece of nature. I am too ADD to meditate the regular way. But that, for me, is a version of self-care. Healthy. I have multiple sclerosis. Wild blueberries are the best food for brain health. When I eat my wild blueberries and I feel healthier, it's a version of self-care. Rejuvenated or rested. I have a widowed client who has support from her mom, which is awesome. And her mom will take her 2 kids once a month. And my widowed client gets to go for 2 nights to a hotel, order room service, binge on Netflix. That helps when we're looking at rest or rejuvenation, productive. I have clients call me sometimes and they'll be like, "John, I know this sounds stupid, but I spent all weekend cleaning out my garage and I feel so much better." And I said, that doesn't sound stupid. Productivity for some of us can be a version of self-care. I know that with my career, when I do a video and I press publish on Facebook or Instagram, I feel better. That is a version of self-care and hopeful. We talked about hope and how for so long I didn't have hope and I hated the idea of hope. I don't think anyone needs to force themselves into hope. But when it comes, or when we find it, or when it finds us, we should not deprive ourselves of that hope. And hope can look a lot of different ways. Let me give you an example. So the first Camp Widow I went to was in San Diego in 2017. And I fell in love with it. When Michelle and I reunited after 7 years, she had a 4-year-old daughter, Emma. The whole 2.5 years that Michelle was dying, I thought I was never going to see Emma ever again. But they passed a law 22 days before she died, and I was able to go to court and win 12 months visitation. So I'm at Camp Widow and I'm having these moments and I'm funny again, and I'm actually smiling again, and I feel part of a community and all these things. And I'm like, I need to move here. This is my happy place. And I looked at the calendar and I'm like, well, Emma's not 18 for 7 years. Another 7 years. That just hit me. I never realized the correlation there. 7 years. Michelle came back in my life. 7 years. I'm waiting for San Diego. Ooh. So one of the things I would do is when it was 2 degrees here in Chicago and snowing, and I would have to drive Emma in the middle of winter to school, and I'd be like, I hate it here. Get all mad. I would come back and I would get my phone and I would go on rent.com and I would look at properties for rent in San Diego, because that for me gave me some hope, gave me something to look forward to. That for me was a version of self-care. To me, you feeling any of these things for even just a moment is a version of self-care. Now, some of you might be listening to this thinking, John, I have no idea what even makes me feel these things. I have no idea what makes me feel happy or peaceful, healthy or rested, productive or hopeful. So let me use this example. Here on the screen right now, I have Steve. I'm looking at Steve, okay? Don't be uncomfortable, Steve. You're my viewpoint. So I'm gonna use you as an example. Steve, you said you're in Illinois somewhere. I remember that because I'm in Illinois, right? Yes. Let's say I pick you up and we go to the local coffee shop and we're having coffee. And in walks a man from about 100 feet away. And I nudge you in the shoulder. And I'm like, hey, Steve, what makes that man over there happy? You say, what man, John? The man in the blue shirt. He just walked in. Oh, I got fluent today. The man in the blue shirt. He just walked in. What makes him happy? You would look at me and you'd say, John, I have no idea what makes that man happy because I don't know who that man is. He's a stranger to me. I feel like for a vast majority of widowed people, not all of us necessarily, but for a vast majority of us, when our person dies, a big part of us goes with them. And then you add on all the secondary losses and all the other stuff that comes with it. And we feel like a stranger to ourselves. And it's very hard to know what would make you happy if you feel like a stranger to yourself. But these 6 words are such an easy place to start. Writing these 6 words down and saying, I'm going to zone in on who I'm around when I feel better and who I'm around when I feel worse, what I'm doing when I feel better, what I'm doing when I feel worse, where I'm at when I feel better, where I'm at when I feel worse. Writing these on a list and actually writing down every time something pops into your head and writing down as it changes. Because if somebody had me make this list a year out versus 7 years out, it would look profoundly different. But that is a version and a huge version of self-care and getting to know yourself again. Let's look at some bullet points for self-care before we get to the next kind of section. Grieving the way that you need to grieve is a huge version of self-care. We know that much of society is grief illiterate. I was grief illiterate before I became a widowed person. I had a lot of loss in my life. I lost my dad, friends, family. I didn't understand this type of loss. Grieving the way that you need to grieve, despite what anyone else thinks or says to you, is a huge and unbelievably important part of self-care. When you empower yourself to do that, to grieve the way you have to grieve, once you start to rebuild, you are now empowered to rebuild the way that you want and need to rebuild. And once you start to actually live again, you're empowered to live the way that you want to live. Because I promise you, if anybody out there is dealing with any form of judgment, the same people that are judging the way that you're grieving are going to judge the way that you're living as well. That's versions of self-care. Giving yourself grace is a huge version of self-care. Absolutely huge. Understanding that rebuilding is not linear. Everyone knows grief is not linear. Yeah, it's not. It's as far from linear as you can get. But rebuilding is right up next to it. If losing my wife is the hardest thing I've ever had to deal with, and it is, rebuilding has not been easy. You know, I had somebody at the self-care workshop I just did in Tampa, which was like the full workshop. Again, we're going to just go through some bullet points here today. Say to me, but it's hard. I said, I know it's hard. Losing your person is one of the hardest experiences you can experience in this human experience. There's nothing easy about it, and there's nothing easy about rebuilding. I wish there were like widowed fairy godmothers, right? Who would like come and sprinkle things on us and like, oh, you lost like the love of your life. Everything from here on out is going to be easy peasy, but that's not how it is. So giving yourself grace is a huge version of self-care. Giving yourself credit for how far you've come is a huge version of self-care. When we give ourselves credit, we build the momentum to keep going. But beyond that, beyond just how far you have come, what I've started saying to clients recently, or when I give speeches, is I need you to look at the results, but I need you to stare at the effort. I need you to look at the results, but I need you to stare at the effort, meaning that even if your effort, you feel it's not paying off, you're still giving that effort. And you need to give yourself all the credit in the world for that. Being honest about your pain is a version of self-care. Because again, when you're honest about your pain, and I'm not talking about in a martyr way, I'm not saying we have to say we have the worst pain in the history of all pain. I'm not saying that. But when you're honest about your pain, you're able to see your effort, your results, and you're able to build momentum. Those are versions of self-care. Having boundaries with people, versions of self-care. Planning ahead. All right, in a week, I'm going out with my best friend, Susie. In 3 months, I'm going to Camp Widow. Planning ahead can be a version of self-care. Journaling and releasing emotions. Finding someone to talk to can be a version of self-care. Focusing in on what you can control and letting the rest go, as hard as that is, can be a version of self-care. The last two things I want to talk about today are really, really important, but we're doing really well on time. So I'm going to talk about this as well for a moment. We lose our biggest cheerleader. We lose our person. We lose the person we walked with. We lose, for most of us, the person who urged us on, etc. And when they pass, our self-esteem and our self-worth can take a huge hit. Self-esteem, self-worth, and self-sabotage are my absolute 3 favorite things to talk about. We can't get into it much here today, but I want to talk about it for a few moments. The first thing I want to talk about is a couple of reasons why that may happen. Again, we lost our biggest cheerleader. Judgment from the outside world, secondary losses as far as people exiting our life, feeling like the third wheel, right? Michelle was sick for 2.5 years. I wasn't exactly taking care of myself in those 2.5 years, nor was I exactly taking care of myself after she died. I had horrible self-esteem the first 31 years of my life, like horrible. So I'm 38 now. My wife, no, I had horrible self-esteem, the first 32 years of my life. My wife passed when I was 31, meaning that I didn't start to work on myself in the way I felt about myself until after my wife died. The first thing I want to talk about here is not as important. The second 2 are more important, but let's talk about the first one. I have a client. I'm going to give you a client story here for a second. I have a client who called me, and she had been abused by her husband, and he had cheated many times. And she called me, and she had really bad self-esteem and self-worth. In the first couple of sessions, we're dealing with grief and self-worth. And then session 4 or 5, I want to look at self-esteem. Her words, not mine. She said she was about 150 pounds overweight. So we're doing the self-esteem call, and she had joined the gym the day prior. And I said, is there anything you do to yourself, anything that makes you feel better about yourself physically in any way? And she said, well, I joined the gym yesterday and that helped. I go, good, bravo, I love it. I said, anything else? And she said, well, when I do my hair and my makeup, I feel a little bit better about myself. I said, okay. I said, how do you feel? She goes, well, I feel kind of cute. I go, okay, that's interesting. I said, how often do you do it? And she said, 1 day a month. I said, okay, why only once a month? She said, well, I work from home. Nobody sees me. I said, yeah, but you see yourself. And I said, I don't care what you do or don't do. But because we've done 4 or 5 sessions now, and I know self-esteem is an issue that you want to work on, let's talk about this. I said, what if I said to you, do your hair and your makeup Monday through Friday for a whole month? She said, oh, you don't want me to do it on the weekends too? She got kind of like a little bit defensive, like she didn't want to do it. I said, no, I don't want you to do it on the weekends because I want you to see the difference. I want you to see how you feel Monday through Friday, and then I want you to see when you're not doing it. So she did it, and we talked a month later, and I said, after we went through some of the basics about what had happened the last month, did you do it? And she said, yeah. And I said, how'd you feel? And she goes, I actually felt good. I felt cute. I felt confident. The truth is, when our people are sick or if they died suddenly or whatever the case is, we're grieving after they die. Most of us don't care what we look like in the mirror. But the other truth is that self-esteem and self-worth are absolutely so important. Everyone knows like the basics, the basic things that are important, right? Like, do you have a support system, right? Like, are you okay financially? Or are you almost going to be homeless? Like, there's a lot of things that are important to what a widowed person looks like after they lose their person. But there's four things that maybe go a little bit beyond what the eye can see. Hope, the hope that you can somehow, some way survive this unimaginable pain and actually rebuild one day. Empowerment, the empowerment to grieve your own way and then eventually to rebuild and live your own way. And self-esteem and self-worth, the self-esteem to step back out into the world once you are ready. I'm not pressuring you. And I don't mean about dating. I mean, step out into the world in any way. I used to be horrible with eye contact because I had such a low self-esteem. And I went to my first Camp Widow and I had a conversation with myself. And I said, you can't do that here. You're going to be speaking. You got a book up there. People know you. I said, you can't be talking to Jenny and she's telling you about her deceased husband and your eyes are going this way, that way, and every other way because of the way you feel about yourself. I recognized how badly my self-esteem had held me back my entire life. And I began to focus in on what I can do better. That's a version of self-care. And one of the things I did that's so minor, but it sticks in my head, is about a year after Michelle died. I was still feeling obviously really bad about myself, but I wanted to start working on myself. I went and I bought the cologne that I wore in high school that I liked and that she loved. I went and I bought it and I would spray it on myself. And that one little tiny, tiny, tiny thing, just for a moment, it wasn't life-changing, but for a moment, it made me feel better about myself. And this is what I'm trying to say, because we have so many people here who are so new. It's not about finding the life-changing things necessarily in these moments. It's about zoning in on the small things. The people that make you feel better versus the people that make you feel worse. The moments where you smile. The moments where you feel some peace. The moments where you feel some hope. The things you can do that make you feel better about yourself, whether it's working out or your nails or talking to your best friend or reading a book. This is self-care. The last two things I want to talk about before we take questions. This is the one I get the most resistance on all the time because we were not programmed to think this way. It's the way that we speak to ourselves. Again, I'm 38. I hated myself the first 31 years of my life. I began to turn the corner around age 32 or 33. I started being nice to myself before I liked myself. I started treating myself the way that I would treat someone I loved way before I loved myself. I started being kind to myself even when I didn't want to be kind to myself. I started trying to save myself before I felt as though I was worth saving. I could tell a million stories about friends and clients and myself in moments where people realize how mean they are to themselves. And I think this happens even more in the widowed community because of everything we lost and all the judgment and all the pain. But the way that you speak to yourself actually matters. Why are we kind to the people that we love? Why did I treat my wife, Michelle, the right way? Why do I show love and encouraging words to my stepdaughter, Emma? Because I love them, because I mean it, and because I know that it will build them up. Tearing yourself down is going to get you nowhere. And even if that's where you want to be, because that's how you feel about yourself right now, I want you to think about how you treat people every day that you may not be the biggest fan of. I wasn't going to say this, but I'm gonna say the story. So I had a client I was talking to last week, and she admitted something to me after a couple of years of working together. She admitted that when she eats something she's not supposed to eat, she calls herself a fat, stupid expletive. And I said, you never told me that. It's been a couple of years. And she said, I know, I'm ashamed. I said, okay. I said, would you ever say that to someone you love? She said, no. So would you ever say that to someone you like? No. Would you ever say that to someone you dislike? No. Would you ever say that to someone you hate? She thought about it for a second. She's like, nope. But we treat ourselves that way all the time. You can have all the chocolate cake and bubble baths and massages and meditation you want. And that's self-care, all of it's self-care. But if you're constantly beating yourself up, what's more important? And you have the ability, if you're doing that, there might not be that many people here who do that, but if you're one of the people who does that, you have the ability to stop that right here, right now, today. You don't have to like yourself. You don't have to love yourself to stop that. You have the ability to be kind to yourself even before you like yourself or love yourself. It's the last thing I want to talk about here, and then we'll take questions. One of the most important things I have done since Michelle has passed is I learned to remove myself from the situation. Okay, so let me tell you guys what that means. Let's say that my wife was still alive. Woman of my dreams was still here and we were as happy as could be. We never went through any of the pain or the trauma or the loss, right? We're just happy as could be. And one day I'm at the coffee shop and I stumbled upon some guy there and we start having a conversation and he tells me that he's new to the area and he doesn't know anybody. And he asked me to go get a beer with him. I'm like, yeah, okay, let's go. So I go home and I tell Michelle, hey, I think I made a new friend. She's like, I'm gonna go meet him for a beer. And she's like, good, get out of here. You're annoying me. I need some space, right? So I go meet him for a beer. And I still have the perfect little life. And he's telling me his story, but it's my story. He's telling me his story of loss, of pain, of trauma, of heartache, of secondary losses. He's telling me his story of how the love of his life came back in his life. And she had a kid. He took on the kid and loved the kid. And how she got diagnosed with cancer and then how she died. And how after she died, he had to go to court for 2.5 years and fight for visitation. He got diagnosed with MS and he was almost homeless before he did this weird thing that started this weird business. Coaching people, that's weird. He's telling me his story of all the secondary losses and the pain, and the moments on the floor sobbing, where he was convinced that he could never, ever, ever, ever get up. There's this thing that happens to a lot of widowed people, and it doesn't happen to everybody. So please hear me on that. But a lot of widowed people, at least once. Sometimes it just happens once, and sometimes it's something they carry with them for a long time. A lot of widowed people have this thing where that sometimes they feel less than. And I know I walked around for a very long time feeling less than. My dream girl wasn't here anymore. Walking with her was the greatest walk in the history of the world. And now I'm just walking alone. And everyone's looking at me like I'm this 31, 33-year-old single guy or divorced guy. And my family's not supportive and the secondary losses and pain. And I felt less than for a very long time. And I take myself back to that example of the man in the coffee shop where I have my perfect life and he's telling me his story, but it's my story. And I think to myself, what would you think about that man, John? Oh, you wouldn't think he was less than, would you? You would think he was a superhero. And I know we don't want to be superheroes. I know we're tired, but you would think he was the most amazing, I'm not going to use the word strong, was the most amazing dude you had met, because how did he get up? How is he talking to me coherently after all he's been through? How is he smiling? How is he doing that? Removing myself from the situation was an absolute game changer. And I promise you, if you take what I just said, and even if it doesn't, you don't feel it right now, if you put it in your memory bank, and if you're ever feeling less than, or you're questioning yourself, or you don't see your effort or your progress, if you take yourself back to the example I just gave you, and you remove yourself from the situation, you act as though you're meeting someone who has your story. You still have your life intact. You're meeting someone and they have your story. And you think about, what would I think of this person? That to me is perhaps the most grand version of self-care. And it is an absolute game changer. And with that said, we can take some questions.